In 1806, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, there lived a man no one truly knew, yet everyone feared. His name was James, the town's gravedigger, a figure seen only at dawn or long after nightfall, when the fog crept low and the living stayed indoors. He never spoke to people, not once, but those who passed the graveyard after sunset swore they heard him whispering, soft, deliberate words meant only for the dead beneath his feet. No one knew where he came from, why he chose that lonely work, or what secrets he buried along with the bodies. What the town didn't realize was that James wasn't just tending graves. He was guarding something far more disturbing. The first time anyone in Hollow Creek noticed something peculiar about James Whitlock. He was 7 years old, standing knee-deep in Copper Creek, with his hands cupped around something invisible. His mother, Sarah Whitlock, called to him from the bank, where she was beating laundry against the rocks, her voice sharp with the particular anxiety that mountain mothers reserve for children who wander too close to water. James didn't respond. She called again, louder this time, and when he still didn't turn, she waded into the creek herself, her skirts gathering water like a sponge. When she reached him, she spun him around by his thin shoulders, ready to scold, but the words died in her throat. His eyes were focused on something past her, through her, beyond the physical realm of creek stones and hemlock trees. "There's a girl," he said softly, his first words in 3 days. "She says she drowned here, 2 summers before I was born." Sarah Whitlock went pale as birch bark. There had indeed been a drowning in Copper Creek, a girl of 9, named Patience Miller, who'd slipped on moss-covered rocks while fetching water. But James couldn't have known that. The Whitlocks had moved to Hollow Creek only the previous spring, from over the mountain in Virginia, and mountain folk didn't speak much of their dead to outsiders. That evening Sarah mentioned the incident to her husband, Thomas, who was a practical man of reasonable faith and little imagination. He suggested the boy had overheard talk at the general store, though even he seemed uncertain. They agreed to watch James more carefully, but the strangeness only deepened. By the time James reached his 15th year, he had earned a reputation throughout the Appalachian hollows as the boy who wouldn't speak to the living, but carried on lengthy conversations with empty air. People crossed themselves when he passed. Mothers pulled their children close. The Methodist circuit preacher, when he made his quarterly rounds through Hollow Creek, suggested an exorcism, though he admitted he didn't quite know how to perform one. Thomas Whitlock, worn down by whispers and sideways glances, finally confronted his son in their cabin one November evening. The fire crackled. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, dusting the dark, mountains with white. "Boy," Thomas said, his voice harder than he intended, "you'll speak when spoken to like a Christian. This foolishness ends tonight." James, tall for his age but thin as a rail fence, looked at his father with eyes the color of creek water in shadow. "I do speak, Pa. Just not to those who can still answer." "That's devil talk." "No, sir." James's voice was gentle, almost pitying. "The devil doesn't want anything to do with the dead. They've already chosen their path." Thomas raised his hand, ready to strike sense into his son, but Sarah stepped between them. She had spent 8 years watching her boy, had seen the way he moved through the world like a man walking through a dream. She had also noticed something else. Every person James claimed to speak with, when she later made careful inquiries, had actually existed, had actually died. "Let him be, Thomas," she said quietly. "God has given him a burden. Who are we to question it?" Thomas lowered his hand, but the defeat in his eyes spoke volumes. 3 months later, he would be dead himself, crushed when a widowmaker branch fell during a late winter storm. James had warned him that morning not to go into the woods, had said a man with Thomas's face was standing by the door, beckoning. Thomas had gone anyway, pride being harder than oak and heavier than stone. After his father's death, James stopped trying to speak to the living altogether. The year was 1806, and James Whitlock was 21 years old when he first took up the spade as a profession. The War of Independence was 2 decades past, but these mountains remembered everything and forgot nothing. Old revolutionary soldiers still gathered to tell tales, their weathered faces lit by firelight, their missing limbs testament to a freedom purchased in blood and pain. James had tried other work. He had apprenticed with a blacksmith who fired him after 1 week, when James kept addressing the corner of the forge where no one stood. He had attempted to work in his uncle's mill, but the miller's wife, a superstitious woman from the old country, refused to have him near after he described her deceased first husband in perfect detail, down to the mole on his left cheek and the way he'd sung hymns off-key. It was old Marcus Finch, Hollow Creek's gravedigger for 40 years, who finally offered James honest work. Marcus was dying, his lungs filled with the mountain damp that took so many, and he needed someone to pass his trade to. Most young men wanted nothing to do with the dead, but Marcus had noticed how James spent his afternoons in the cemetery, sitting among the stones, his lips moving in conversation. "Boy," Marcus wheezed one spring morning, "you fancy the dead?" "They're the only ones who tell the truth," James replied, not looking at him. "That's a fact." Marcus nodded, then coughed, a wet rattling sound. "They got no reason to lie anymore. I'm dying and I need someone to take over. Job's yours, if you want it. No one else'll do it." James considered this. The living had made it clear there was no place for him in their world, but the dead, they needed someone to lay them properly to rest, someone to listen to their final words. "I'll do it," he said. Marcus smiled, showing 3 remaining teeth. "Good. I'll teach you the trade, how to dig so the walls don't collapse, where the bedrock runs shallow, which families want their plots deep and which want them near the surface for easier resurrection on Judgment Day." He paused, his rheumy eyes studying James. "And I suppose you already know how to listen to what they got to say." So James became a gravedigger, and the dead became his congregation. People who watched from a distance, and there were always people watching, reported strange scenes in Hollow Creek Cemetery. They would see James standing in an open grave, talking earnestly to the earth, or kneeling beside a fresh mound, his hand pressed to the soil, nodding as if receiving instructions. Sometimes he would laugh, though it was a sad sound, like wind through a hollow log. The truth was more complex than they knew. The dead, James discovered, were not what the preachers said they were. They weren't sleeping peacefully, awaiting Gabriel's horn. They weren't dancing in heaven or suffering in hell. Most of them were still here, tethered to the earth by invisible threads of memory, regret, and love. They lingered in the in-between places, not quite gone, not quite anywhere else, and they were lonely. "I never told her I loved her," said Samuel Mackenzie, a logger who'd been killed when a tree fell wrong. His spirit stood at the edge of his own grave, watching James dig. "My Mary. Married 42 years, and I never said the words. Figured she knew. Figured showing was the same as telling. James paused in his digging, leaning on his spade. "It's not the same," he said quietly. "I know that now. Can you tell her? Can you go to her and say I loved her? That I always loved her? She won't hear me. The living never do. Please." James looked at the spirit, at the desperate hope in its eyes, and felt the familiar ache in his chest. "I'll try," he promised, knowing it would do no good. He went to Mary Mackenzie's cabin the next day, hat in hand, and tried to explain. She looked at him with hard eyes. This mountain woman who'd buried 4 children and a husband. "I don't need you to tell me what Samuel felt," she said coldly. "The dead are gone. You're touched in the head, James Whitlock, and you'd do well to keep your foolishness to yourself." She shut the door in his face. James returned to the cemetery and told Samuel what had happened. The spirit wept, if spirits could weep, a soundless shaking that made the air shimmer. "I know," James said. "I'm sorry. But not all conversations were sad. Eliza Crane, dead at 96, was a gossip in life and remained one in death. She spent her days moving from grave to grave, collecting stories, then sharing them with James as he worked. "Thomas Yancey's boy is courting the Wilkins girl," she'd say, her spectral form perched on a weathered headstone. "She's too good for him, but she doesn't know it yet. And the Reverend's wife is hiding corn whiskey in her root cellar. Don't that beat all?" James sometimes smiled at her observations. "You should rest, Eliza." "Rest? I've got eternity to rest. Right now I'm catching up on what I missed while I was dying. Took me 3 weeks to go, and you miss a lot in 3 weeks. There was also Nathaniel Reed, a Revolutionary War captain whose grave was marked with a modest stone and a fading American flag. Nathaniel's spirit was stronger than most, more solid, as if his will alone kept him anchored to the world. "I can't leave," he told James one evening, as the sun set behind the mountains in shades of blood orange and deep purple. "Not until I know what happened to my men. We were ambushed, you see, near the Cherokee Ford. Half my company didn't make it, but 3 men were never found, never accounted for. I need to know if they made it home, or if they're lying in some unmarked grave in the wilderness." "That was 30 years ago," James said gently. "They're long dead now, Captain, whether they made it home or not." "I know, but I need to know they're at peace. A captain's responsibility doesn't end with death." James began making inquiries carefully, so as not to seem too strange. He asked old veterans about Reed's company, about the ambush at Cherokee Ford. Eventually, he pieced together what had happened. 2 of the missing men had made it home, had lived long lives, had been buried in distant churchyards with honors. The 3rd had died of his wounds in a Cherokee village, where he'd been given a warrior's burial. When James told Nathaniel, the captain's spirit seemed to solidify, to become more real, just for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for freeing me." And then he was gone, truly gone, the tether finally cut. The winter of 1809 was the hardest anyone in Hollow Creek could remember. The snow came early and stayed late. The cold was so fierce it split trees down the middle with sounds like rifle shots, and a fever swept through the settlement, taking the weakest first, as fevers always do. The children died, 1 by 1, then 2 by 2, then in clusters they succumbed. Sarah Morton's twin boys, the Anderson baby who'd only lived 3 weeks, 7 of the Hendricks children, leaving only the oldest, a girl of 12, to help her mother endure. By the time spring finally came, James had dug 23 small graves. It was the worst work he'd ever done. Children's spirits were different from adults. They were less tethered, more willing to move on, but also more confused about what had happened to them. They didn't understand death the way adults did. They kept asking for their mothers, wondering when they could go home. James would kneel beside their tiny graves and try to explain, using words that didn't frighten, painting pictures of a bright place where they would never be cold or sick again. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the small spirits would fade away, heading toward whatever lay beyond. But some stayed, too confused or too young to understand. Little Margaret Hendricks, dead at 4, stayed. She would follow James around the cemetery, chattering about her dolly and her kitten and when Papa was coming to take her home. James's heart broke a little more each day. "Margaret," he would say, "your Papa can't come. You have to go on without him. There are people waiting for you, good people, in the bright place. But I want Papa. I know, sweetheart, I know." One day, something changed. James was digging a grave, not for a child this time, but for an old woman who died peacefully in her sleep, when he felt someone watching him. Not a spirit, someone alive. He turned and saw a woman standing at the cemetery gate. She was tall and dark-haired, dressed in mourning black, and she was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen directed his way before. Not fear, not disgust, but curiosity. He went back to his work, assuming she'd come to visit a grave. But she didn't move toward any particular plot. She just stood there, watching him. Finally, she walked closer. "You're James Whitlock," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Mom." "They say you speak to the dead." James's hands tightened on his spade. "People say a lot of things." "My daughter," the woman continued, her voice steady but strained, "died 3 months ago. The fever took her. She was 6 years old. Her name was Ruth." James remembered. Ruth Carson, dark hair like her mother's, bright eyes, a laugh that carried. Her grave was beneath the oak tree, marked with a river stone, because the family couldn't afford a proper headstone yet. "I remember," he said softly. "Can you see her? Is she here?" James looked around the cemetery at the dozen or so spirits visible to him. Ruth was there, playing with Margaret Hendricks near the stone wall, both of them chasing something invisible, laughing soundlessly. "Yes," he said, "she's here." The woman, Emily Carson, drew in a sharp breath. Is she suffering? Is she afraid?" "No, Mom, she's playing. She seems happy." Emily closed her eyes, and tears slipped down her cheeks. "Can you tell her I love her? Can you tell her I'm sorry I couldn't save her?" "Mrs. Carson, she knows. Children always know. Please, please just tell her." So James walked to where Ruth's spirit played, and he knelt down, and he spoke to her. "Ruth, your mama's here. She wants you to know she loves you. She's sorry she couldn't save you." Ruth stopped playing and looked past James to where her mother stood. The little spirit smiled, a radiant expression, and said, "Tell Mama I'm not sick anymore. Tell her it doesn't hurt. Tell her I'll wait for her in the bright place, but she has to live a long, long time first. Promise me you'll tell her." James returned to Emily and repeated Ruth's words exactly. Emily Carson fell to her knees in the grass and wept, great shuddering sobs that shook her entire body. But they weren't entirely sobs of grief. There was relief in them and something like joy. Word spread. People began coming to James in secret at first. They would arrive at the cemetery at dusk or dawn when few others were around, and they would ask him to find their dead. A mother seeking a son killed in a hunting accident. A husband wanting to know if his wife's final moments were painful. A sister hoping for forgiveness for a long-ago quarrel. James helped when he could, though it tore at him. Every conversation with the living reminded him of how separate he was from them, how he existed in the space between worlds, belonging fully to neither. But the dead needed him, needed someone to speak for them, and the living needed the dead, needed to know their loved ones weren't lost forever. Reverend Josiah Bartlett, the new Methodist preacher who'd replaced the circuit rider, heard about what James was doing and came to confront him one morning in September. He was a young man, full of righteous conviction and seminary learning. "What you're doing is necromancy," he declared, standing over James as he tended the grass around a grave. "It's against God's law. It's trafficking with demons." James stood, meeting the preacher's eyes. At 24, he'd grown into his height, had the lean, strong build of a man who worked with his body. His eyes, though, were older than his years, filled with things he'd seen that others couldn't imagine. "Reverend," he said quietly, "do you believe in heaven?" "Of course I do." "Do you believe the dead go there?" "The righteous do, yes." "Then why would it be wrong to speak with them? If they're in heaven, they're with God. How could that be demonic?" Bartlett frowned. Because the Bible forbids it. Deuteronomy, 1 Samuel, the witch of Endor. The Bible also says to love your neighbor and comfort the grieving, James countered. "These people come to me in pain. They need to know their loved ones are at peace. How is giving them that comfort against God's will? You could be lying to them. You could be telling them what they want to hear. I could be, but I'm not." They stared at each other, and something in James's eyes must have communicated a truth beyond argument, because Reverend Bartlett finally looked away. "I'll pray for you," he said. "Thank you," James replied sincerely. "I need all the prayers I can get." But not everyone was as easily satisfied as the young reverend. There were those who saw James as a threat, a violation of natural law. A group of men, led by Hiram Cobb, a farmer who believed any oddity was evidence of witchcraft, confronted James one October evening as he was leaving the cemetery. "We want you gone," Cobb said, 6 men backing him up, all carrying sticks or tools. "You're an abomination. You're scaring our children and leading people away from proper Christianity." James stood his ground, though his heart bounded. "I'm just a gravedigger, Mr. Cobb. I do my work and bother no one." "You talk to empty air and claim the dead speak back. That's bothering. That's unnatural." "What would you have me do? Leave. This is my home." "Then stop your devil talk. Stop telling people you can speak to their dead. It's lies or it's demonic, and either way, it needs to stop." James felt a familiar presence beside him, though he didn't look. Nathaniel Reed's spirit had returned, though James didn't understand how or why. Other spirits were gathering too, drawn by the confrontation, forming a circle around James and the living men. "I can't stop," James said. "It's not something I chose. It's what I am." Cobb raised his stick. "Then we'll beat some sense into you." What happened next became the stuff of legend in Hollow Creek. The men who were there told different stories, but all agreed on the basic facts. As Cobb moved to strike, a wind came up from nowhere, cold as a January morning, and the temperature dropped so fast they could see their breath. The air seemed to thicken, to press against them. Several men swore they saw shapes in that wind, faces in the gathering darkness. Hiram Cobb's stick was torn from his hand by that impossible wind and flung 20 feet away. He stumbled backward, his face pale with terror. "Leave him be," a voice said, though no one could agree afterward whether they'd heard it with their ears or in their minds. "He belongs to us as much as he belongs to you." The men fled. James stood alone in the cemetery as the wind died down and the temperature returned to normal. The spirits faded from view one by one, until only Nathaniel remained. "Thank you, Captain," James said. "We protect our own," Nathaniel replied. "And you, James Whitlock, are ours as much as you're theirs." The years passed, as years do. James grew older, his dark hair showing silver, his face becoming lined. His mother, Sarah, died in 1815, whispering as she went that she could see Thomas waiting for her. James, holding her hand, saw his father's spirit at the bedside, saw the moment when Sarah's spirit rose to meet him, saw them embrace and fade together into something beyond his sight. He wept then, rare tears, not for his mother's passing, but for the beauty of that reunion. The cemetery grew. More stones, more graves, more stories. James knew every person buried there, knew their tales, both the ones carved on their headstones and the ones only the dead could tell. He became a keeper of memory, an archive of lives that would otherwise be forgotten. Young people grew up hearing stories about the strange gravedigger who spoke to empty air. Some mocked him. Others felt a fascinated fear. But everyone respected what he did, the dignity with which he tended the dead. In 1820, a cholera outbreak swept through the valley, and James dug more graves in 3 months than he had in the previous 2 years. Among the dead was Reverend Bartlett, struck down in his prime while ministering to the sick. His spirit, freed from his mortal certainty, found James in the cemetery. "I was wrong," the Reverend's ghost said, "about you, about what you do." "You did what you thought was right," James replied, covering the last grave of the outbreak. "I was so sure I understood God's will. But being dead teaches you humility." Bartlett paused. "There's something beyond, James. Something I can see but can't quite reach. It's beautiful, more beautiful than anything I preached about. But I can't go there yet. I have to wait. For what? I don't know, but I know when it's time." "That's faith," James said. "Real faith. Not certainty, but trust." Many of James's conversations followed this pattern, the dead coming to understand that life had been more complex than they'd realized, that their certainties had been illusions, that death was both an ending and a beginning. But some spirits never found peace. Old grudges kept them tethered, or unresolved crimes, or secrets they'd carried to their graves. James learned to identify these tortured souls, learned which ones he could help, and which were beyond even his reach. There was Jacob Thorne, murdered by his brother over a land dispute, who spent decades trying to reveal the truth. But the brother had died too, unrepentant, and there was no justice to be had except in whatever lay beyond. There was Martha Grayson, dead in childbirth, who couldn't let go of the child who'd survived. Her spirit haunted her daughter for years, trying to guide and protect, not understanding that such attachment was a burden rather than a blessing. James finally convinced her to release her hold, to trust that others would care for her child. These were hard lessons, hard conversations, but James learned patience. He had nothing but time. James was 51 years old when he first realized he was dying. The cough started in winter and didn't stop when spring came. He knew the signs, had seen them in others. The weight loss, the fatigue, the faint taste of blood, consumption, the white plague. It was taking him as it had taken Marcus Finch, as it took so many who worked in the damp earth. He didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell. His mother was long dead. He'd never married, had no siblings. His only family was the dead, and they already knew. Spirits could sense these things, could see the thinning of the veil around him. "You're coming to us," Eliza Crane said one morning, her spectral form more solid than it had been in years. "Finally coming to see what we see." "Soon," James agreed. "What will happen to them?" Nathaniel Reed asked, gesturing to the cemetery. "Who will speak for us when you're gone?" James had wondered the same thing. Maybe no one. Maybe I was just a fluke, a strange gift given to one strange man. Or maybe there will be others. The world is larger and stranger than any of us know. As his illness progressed, James found he could see more than just the dead of Hollow Creek. Walking through the town, he saw spirits everywhere, crowds of them, generations upon generations who hadn't moved on, who lingered for reasons only they understood. The world, he realized, was far more populated than the living suspected. He also found he could see other things, threads of light connecting people to each other, to places, to moments in time. The world was a vast web of connections, and death didn't sever those connections, merely transformed them. One evening in early autumn, as the leaves began to turn and the air carried the scent of wood smoke and coming frost, James was sitting on a bench in the cemetery when a child approached him. She was alive, about 7 years old, with tangled blonde hair and a serious expression. "Mr. James," she said. He looked at her with surprise. Children usually avoided him. "Yes?" "My grandmother says you talk to dead people." "Some people think so." "Can you see them now? Are there any here?" James glanced around at the dozens of spirits visible to him, all watching this exchange with interest. "Yes, there are many here." "Can you see my grandfather?" "He died last year. Grandma says he's in heaven, but I think maybe he's here sometimes too." "What was his name?" "Jeremiah Collins." James knew the grave, had dug it himself. He looked and saw Jeremiah's spirit near the back wall, watching with an expression of profound love. "He's here," James said gently. "He's watching over you." The girl smiled, a bright expression that lit her entire face. "I knew it. I could feel him sometimes." "What does he look like?" James described Jeremiah, and the girl nodded at each detail. Then she did something unexpected. She looked directly at where her grandfather's spirit stood, as if she could see him. "I love you, Grandpa," she said, and Jeremiah's spirit seemed to glow, seemed to become more real. And James understood something profound. The living could feel the dead, even if they couldn't see them. Love transcended the veil. The girl ran off, and James was left with a sense of peace he'd rarely felt. His gift, his burden, wouldn't end with him. It was there in that child's ability to sense her grandfather. Perhaps it was in others too. People who felt presences but dismissed them as imagination, who dreamed of the dead and called them only dreams. Maybe everyone could speak to the dead, if they were willing to listen. James died on a Tuesday in November 1826, 20 years after he'd first taken up the spade as a profession. He died in his small cabin at the edge of the cemetery, alone in body, but surrounded in spirit. Every ghost he'd ever helped, every spirit he'd counseled or comforted, gathered around his bedside. "Don't be afraid," said his mother's voice, though he couldn't see her yet. Not quite. "I'm not," he whispered. And it was true. Death held no fear for him. He'd spent his entire life at its border, had seen what lay beyond. Not everything, not clearly, but enough. The pain in his chest eased. His breathing slowed. The room seemed to grow brighter, though the sun was setting outside. And then he saw them, not as vague shapes or transparent forms, but as solid and real as living people. His mother and father standing together. Marcus Finch, no longer old and sick, but strong and whole. Nathaniel Reed in his revolutionary uniform, standing at attention. The children he'd helped cross over, now laughing and playing, free from sickness and suffering. Hundreds of them, all the dead of Hollow Creek and beyond, come to witness his crossing. "Welcome home, James," Eliza Crane said, taking his hand. He felt his spirit separate from his body, a gentle untethering, like a boat slipping its moorings. He stood up, no longer bound by failing flesh, and looked down at his earthly form lying still on the narrow bed. "Is this death?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "This is the crossing," Nathaniel said. "Death was what you left behind. This is what comes after." James looked around his cabin one last time, at the simple furnishings, the shelf of books, the window overlooking the cemetery. It had been a humble life, a strange life, a lonely life in many ways, but it had been his. "I'm ready," he said. His mother took one hand, his father the other, and together they led him toward the light he could now see clearly, the brilliant, beautiful light that had always been there, just beyond his sight. As he walked toward it, he felt the weight of his gift, his burden, finally lifting. He had been a bridge between worlds. Now he was crossing that bridge himself, leaving the land of the living behind. Behind him, in the cemetery, his body would be found the next morning by Emily Carson, now an old woman herself, come to tend her daughter's grave. She would spread the word, and the people of Hollow Creek would give him a proper burial, though they argued about what to put on his headstone. Some wanted James Whitlock, Gravedigger. Others suggested he spoke for the dead. In the end, they compromised with simple words: James Whitlock, 1785, 1826, at peace. But those with the sight, those few who shared James's gift, even if they'd never acknowledged it, saw something else. A figure standing by that grave, a tall man with kind eyes, still watching over the cemetery, still listening to those who had no voice. Because some bridges, once built, are never truly abandoned, and some voices once raised echo forever. In the mountains of Appalachia, where the mist clings to the hollows and the old ways persist, people still tell stories of James Whitlock. They say that on certain nights, when the veil grows thin, you can see him walking among the gravestones, talking to companions only he can see. They say he's waiting for something, though no one knows what. They say if you need to speak to someone you've lost, truly speak to them. You can go to the cemetery at dawn and whisper their name, and James will listen, will carry your words to wherever the dead reside. Maybe it's true. Maybe it's just a story mountain folk tell to comfort themselves when the darkness grows heavy and death seems too final to bear. But in these mountains, where the boundary between the living and the dead has always been thinner than elsewhere, people believe in the possibility of voices that reach beyond silence, of love that transcends the grave. They believe in James of Appalachia, the gravedigger who spoke only to the dead, and in doing so, gave comfort to the living. They believe in the bridges between worlds, and in those rare souls brave enough to stand upon them